Today is Friday, July 15, 2022. My name is Roger Eardley Pryor from the Oral History Center of the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley. This is interview session number 1 with Michael Yoshii as a part of the Japanese American Intergenerational Narratives Oral History Project. Michael, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for making time to share your stories with us today. To start off, could you share your full name, the date of your birth, its location as well?
Sure. Good morning. My name is Michael Arthur Yoshii. I was born on August 10th, 1952 in Berkeley, California.
All right. Before we dive into stories about family background and your own journeys through life, I want to make sure that we talk about terminology with regard to what happened to your family in the context of Japanese American intergenerational narratives. With your parents and grandparents, what terminology do you use to describe what happened to them during World War II?
I would say I would use the term mass incarceration for the collective experience the Japanese Americans went through, and the location was detention camps. In the case of my family's Topaz, Utah, and Jerome, Arkansas.
What terminology did you hear growing up?
I didn't hear much growing up, and probably that'll be something we talk about today. But I think probably internment camps was probably the phrase that I may have heard from about junior high.
Okay. What terminologies did your family use?
I don't recall them, having any terminology, to tell you the truth.
Yeah. And when was it around, and maybe why did the transition for your use of mass incarceration and detention camps come into play?
I think it's come within the last decade or so, as we look at the phenomenon of incarceration in this country and the fact that there's collective experiences that different communities have. And this was one particular and peculiar to Japanese Americans. So the phrase mass incarceration, I think, really helps describe what happened. And also the language of detention center also is what was happening. People were being detained without their rights, being consulted against their will.
Thank you. To dive into your personal experience, let's step back and explore some of your family background. Could you share a little bit about your mother and father, what their names are, maybe even their birth dates if you know them?
Yeah. So my father's name is Tadashi Yoshii, and he was born on July 28th, 1921. He's now 100 years old. He'll be 101 this month.
Wow.
Still alive and kicking. He was born and raised in Oakland, California, went to public schools there. My mom's name was Lily Sakamoto, and she was born on January 9th, 1922. She passed away in 2017. She grew up on a farm in Fresno. I think she was in Sacramento first and then in Fresno before the wartime.
Okay. And we'll get into the story of your family and your arrival into the world. Do you have any other siblings that Tadashi and Lily had?
Yeah, I have 2 siblings. One older brother, Ken, who is 4 years older than me. He was born in 1948, and he has 3 kids. My 2 nephews and nieces, Jim, Steve, and Allie. And then I have a younger sister who's 7 years younger than me, who was born on Halloween, 1959. I still remember that. And she is married to Jamie, my brother-in-law. They have 2 kids, Jared and Jason.
Great. And what's your sister's name?
My sister's name is Judy.
It's my mother's name.
Judy Fukumai. I didn't mention too, my brother Ken's wife, Carolyn, passed away at an early age, and he had a second wife named Yoko, who was also passed away.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Let's step into your grandparents, maybe begin with your maternal grandparents. Before we dive into the stories about who they are, can you share a little bit about the Zoom background that you've selected?
Sure. This Zoom background is something I've created during the pandemic, and it's taken at the Sunset Mortuary in El Cerrito, where both sets of grandparents are buried. and where my mother is also buried there as well. And so oftentimes I'll take my father up there to say hello to my grandparents and my mom. And this photo was taken on one day where there was a nice sunset. And so I like to use this photo backdrop to bring my grandparents into every meeting that I'm in on Zoom where I can, just to invoke their presence as ancestors, and also for my mom as well.
It couldn't be more perfect for an intergenerational narrative discussion.
Mhm.
Well, let's begin perhaps with your maternal grandparents, with Lily's parents. You mentioned that she grew up in a farm in Sacramento and then in Fresno.
Right.
Can you tell a little bit of the stories of her parents and how they came to the United States?
Sure. So my grandfather on my mom's side, his name was Kamizuchi Sakamoto. He was born in 1888, excuse me, and passed away in 1973. His wife, Yukiko, was a picture bride. I don't know exactly the date she came into the country, but she was born in 1899, a little bit younger than him, and then she passed away in 1985. Interestingly enough, she passed away on Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, 1985. And I didn't find that out I didn't realize that until later on after she had passed. But anyway, their story is they had a farm in Sacramento for a time, and then the bulk of the time, I think that my mom's siblings and her were growing up was in Fresno. So they had a farm there. And then they were interned at the Fresno Assembly Center first, and then to Jerome, Arkansas as a family. I think that was the site of the detention camp for most of the folks in that particular region. So they were there during the duration of the war.
What kind of stuff were they farming in the Central Valley before the war began, before World War II?
I don't really know. I don't really know what their produce was. I know that he went off to market, and I'll share a story about that later on. Also, I should mention that my mom had 3 siblings. Henry was the oldest brother, Hisayo, and then Marion were her 2 sisters.
You'd mentioned that your mother and parents were forced to go to Jerome camp. Were her siblings there with all together?
Yeah, they all went together.
Okay, we'll pick up that story, probably wartime stories, and what happened with your mother, especially as she came out of that experience and then came to meet your father and from his trajectory. But maybe to step back into your father's background, could you share a little bit about your paternal grandparents?
Yeah, so my father's name was Seisuke Yoshii. He was born in 1882 and passed away in 1958. He first went to Hawaii from Japan. I think he was working on sugarcane plantations, and then he made his way to California. And my understanding was that he was here in 1906 because he experienced the earthquake. That's the story that my father and uncle have told me about. And so he ended up, I think, in the East Bay. And again, his wife, Masao Yoshii, was a picture bride. She was born in 1897 and passed away in 1992. And over time, what they were able to do was open up a restaurant in West Oakland, which is now the corner of West Grand and San Pablo in West Oakland. And he had worked for the folks who ran the restaurant. They decided to go back to Japan, and so he was able to purchase it from them. And then that was kind of the family business, kind of a, I don't know, nickel, dime, quarter cafe of sorts. I'm told they had really good meals for 25 cents that included soup and dessert. Yeah.
That's a great deal.
Yeah.
So
they lived in the back of the restaurant. So there was like a back unit where it was like a 1-room place where my father and his brother and parents lived.
Well, that's where your dad grew up, in the back of the restaurant.
Right. Yeah. And I don't know if I mentioned, so he had an older brother, Kiyoshi, who was 3 years older than him. So there were 2 of them, and then my grandparents.
Huh. And it sounds like your grandfather, Seisuke, came to, when he got to California, began working for a Japanese family, a Japanese business. And that's how he then purchased the restaurant from them.
Yeah. So I think he bounced around for different jobs, and then he landed in this restaurant. And what my dad tells me is that he learned the trade from them. He really observed what they were doing, and so that he learned how to kind of run a restaurant and cook as well. They cooked kind of what they call sort of just classic American fare, um, breakfasts, lunches, dinners, stews, and steaks, different things like that. So.
You mentioned that both of your maternal and paternal grandmothers were picture brides, which is really common at that time in the generation. What, for both of your grandfathers, do you know what was the impetus for them to leave Japan to go to, in your paternal grandfather's case, Hawaii first, but both of them eventually coming to California? Do you know why it was they went?
Well, I think both was economic, some opportunity to make money. I think my mother's side of the family. Well, by the way, they were both from Yamaguchi Prefecture in Japan, and so the Sakamoto side, I think, kind of was coming from farming background, and but I don't really know all the details, like family dynamics, because I know with many other families there are kind of like intricacies about why an individual might want to leave, because they're leaving the family too, right? And so I don't know on either side kind of more details about the specific kind of personal causes or maybe personality things that went into it, but
what the family dynamics were.
And I've never met their parents or their family. My fathers and mother have been back to Yamaguchi to meet some distant relatives still in the Sakamoto side, but I haven't had a chance to do that.
And that Yamaguchi Prefecture is in very far southwestern Japan, even south of Hiroshima. Mostly, like you said, country or rural area.
Yeah. So we've come to understand, they both had that sort of Japanese country background, as opposed to sort of the urban, maybe Tokyo immigrants.
That's great. Maybe to tell a little bit of stories about World War II, and you said for your paternal grandparents, especially for Seisuke's work in the restaurant, and then I imagine that his wife helped support that work and they raised their family there.
Right.
What happened with them as the ramp up to World War II, and eventually the 1942 Exclusion Act that forced all the Japanese Americans on the West Coast into these camps?
Yeah. From stories that I've heard from my family, particularly my uncle and my father, is that I don't think my grandfather, who ran the restaurant in Oakland, I don't think he thought this was going to happen. He thought that there wouldn't be a war, so he wasn't preparing for that in any stretch of the imagination. So I think when things came, it was kind of a shock to them, and then they did what they had to do and prepared. My father's brother entered into the 442nd before the war, or entered into the military, excuse me, before the war started. He was part of the draft.
His brother Yoshii?
Kiyoshi, yeah, he was part of the draft, and he entered into the military. So he was already part of the military when the war broke out. And then he got assigned to the 442nd in the process of it. My father and my grandparents, his parents, went to Tanforan initially. Were there, I don't know exactly how many months they were there, but they were there prior to going to Topaz.
In your father's story, his older brother is drafted and then serves in this famed military unit of Japanese Americans, the 442nd. Your father was probably in his early 20s when he and his parents were shipped to Topaz.
Yeah, he would have been 21, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. Was there any consideration of him entering the draft like his brother, or was it that now that he was there to take care of the parents?
Well, we really never talked about his own. I mean, he did enter into the military, not the 442nd, but he entered into it later after he was in Topaz. And he hasn't really talked much about that decision, except that it was kind of his way of also kind of contributing and serving as his brother did. His brother was wounded in the war in Europe and had his arm blown off, and he kind of had to go to a hospital and then do some recovery and had a prosthetic arm put on. So that was like a lifelong injury from the war. And my grandparents were really upset about that. I think he was able to come back and visit them in Topaz on one of his return trips. And I don't know the exact sequence when my father entered into the military himself, but yeah.
Wow. I'm trying to imagine your uncle's experience of training and serving and getting ready to go serve in Europe, and then coming to visit his family in this prison camp in the middle of Utah.
Yeah.
What that was like for all of them.
Yeah, I think it was pretty emotional for all of them. And so as I mentioned, my father went with his parents to Topaz, and then I think it seems like they kind of got settled in there. And then my father was able to get released to look for work, and went. I know he went to Wisconsin, among other places, in a couple of the states, kind of looking for work during the war, and they couldn't. He went with two other friends, I think, and they couldn't find work for all of them. I think one of them could find a job, but then they couldn't all get jobs, so they wanted to stay together. I think they came back to Utah and did some work around the Ogden area, and and then he went into the military. So he was in the military when the war ended, and my understanding is that my uncle brought my grandparents back to California when the war ended and the camps were closed. He was the one that drove them back. Then my father had to meet them as he was discharged from the military. And then they came back to California, and there were housing projects for Japanese Americans in Richmond, California. And that's where they regathered as a family. And that also, by the way, was where my mother's family was as well. They had entered California from Arkansas, and then my mother came. I don't know if they came all together, but I don't know what the sequence was, but she ended up in the Richmond housing projects too. So my dad tells a story that he remembers people were going to introduce him to my mom, because she was coming. I think she was coming from Chicago, if I'm not mistaken, and then so there were some matchmakers that connected them. She came to Richmond.
Sounds like a good setup, looking out for each other that way.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to how both these families ended up at these projects, the housing projects in Richmond. For the paternal side, what happened with the restaurant?
Well, the restaurant was lost. I mean, they had to close that up, and so that was lost to them. And I think that was quite a blow to my grandfather, because he had worked so hard to learn the business and then be able to take it over. And I think he had a pretty, I don't know if it was thriving, but it was a good business for him. And I can tell from my father's stories that they really enjoyed it. They really liked doing that. And in my father's later years, he talks often about the restaurant. I see him, at least once a week, and he often reminisces about the restaurant and what it was like growing up in that neighborhood. And people all got along. The neighboring businesses were really good to each other. The owners of different businesses kind of would come to the bar in the afternoon and have drinks together, and so they had some sense of kind of business camaraderie, I think, in the neighborhood. And so there is kind of that revisiting that I hear my father making when we talk about things today. That was one kind of highlight of life for him, at least, that period of. And he worked in the restaurant too. He really enjoyed helping, do prep work for vegetables and things like that for different dishes. He remembers helping make soups and helping make the coleslaw, things like that. So, and I think that just piecing it together, because I really didn't know my grandfather that well, because he died when I was only 6 years old. That he had poured a lot of his life into that restaurant, and when they came back, I think my dad said they went back to try to see what they can do there, but there was no chance for them to reopen it up.
And on your mother's family side, the maternal side, those grandparents, when they were farming in Fresno and then shipped to the detention camps in Arkansas and then made their way back to California, how was it that they ended up in the Bay Area in Richmond?
I don't really know about what the story is in terms of people from Arkansas coming to Richmond, just where they ended up coming back to.
You had mentioned there was some sort of travel from Chicago, you thought?
Well, my mom and her sisters ended up leaving Jerome to Chicago, and I don't know exactly what year during camp. My grandparents never left there, but my mom and her two sisters were able to leave and get out to Chicago, where they were able to look for work also, and then kind of have some social life there. So I think that's where they were when the war ended, and then they had to come back. I don't know who it was that brought my grandparents back to California. It may have been my uncle. He may have stayed there, but I don't know the details about that.
So, but immediately after the war, both what became your maternal and paternal families were both in these housing projects at Richmond that the federal government had created.
Correct. So this was especially designated for Japanese American returnees.
Oh, interesting. I wonder if there's some relationship between the Kaiser shipping yards that were in that area and all the housing that was for the laborers there.
Yeah, there is a historic display of the wartime housing, and I was asking them if they could do some research on the Japanese American housing as well. So because there's a display called Rosie the Riveter in Richmond, California, where they have an exhibit up there about the activities of the wartime, and also the Southern migrants, particularly the Black community that came into the war industries in California. And then there were housing projects that were set up to accommodate the migrants. But there's no documentation of the housing for the Japanese Americans. And it would be interesting to find that out and see kind of the duration of the housing and so forth. I've taken my dad back there to kind of drive around to see if he remembers exactly where the houses were, and we couldn't identify explicitly just kind of the general neighborhood, but not the specific houses themselves. So I assume that they were there, and then at some point they were gone.
What was the trajectory of your parents? You said that they were set up by mutual friends, knowing that your mother was going to be coming to Richmond. Your father and his family were already there. Can you tell me a little bit about their connection and how that grew?
So I think there was a common friend or another family that knew both of them, and so I think their friend was the one that said, I want to introduce you to this girls that are going to be coming out here. So the story is they went ice skating or something like that and started dating.
That's a great first date, especially if nobody knows how to skate. They can hold on to each other.
Yeah.
That's great. How is it that you learned these family stories? How is it that storytelling and this family history came to you?
In terms of the wartime?
Any of it. I mean, how is it that you learned your family ancestry and these stories that you're sharing with me?
I think probably just piecemeal over time. I mean, it wasn't much of a storytelling family. I know that there are families where within their own sort of culture of their family dynamics, they're kind of telling stories all the time, but that wasn't the case for us per se. And there was always something going on in the family too. And I kind of conjecture that perhaps there was always things that were going on. People were really busy trying to take care of things. And so there wasn't a whole lot of time to sit and talk story.
That term talk story rings a bell for me, that it was something that the Hawaiian pidgin language, the Japanese Americans in Hawaii often would talk about talk story. We're like, let's just connect and talk story. Yeah. Is that something that passed down through your, perhaps your paternal grandfather who spent time in the cane fields?
No, I don't think so. I mean, and again, my grandfather passed away when I was 6 years old, so I never had the chance to like sit at his feet and hear him tell stories. Um, and I don't even remember much conversations with him at all. And my grandmother was very private in some sense. She was very quiet, and there were stories around. I began to understand why later on about her demeanor and things. And my mother's side of the family, though, there was a little bit more going on in terms of like opportunities for stories to be shared, because their home was like a hub of activity for the Sakamoto family. And so, my mom had the three siblings; they all had their families, and we'd have family gatherings. People would come over, and it'd be more like my oldest cousin would be telling stories about my grandfather, or you know, or he'd be asking questions about different things. And so I think he was the oldest grandson, so I think he had more opportunity to interact with particularly my grandfather. And I know he interacted a lot with my father too. So I think there were more stories that my father told him than he probably told us, because my cousin would ask, whereas I don't think me and my brother would ask this in the same way, or it's not the same dynamic.
It strikes me as interesting that you became such a storyteller in your work as a pastor eventually, and sharing stories to help lift your congregation up and to teach lessons, especially from the Bible, and just from life. The family dynamic that you grew up in was not much of a storytelling family.
Well, when I think about it, though, my father was a storyteller. I mean, if I think about it in those terms, that I become a storyteller, that he also was a storyteller, but the kinds of stories, or the things that he would talk about, to me, they tended to be stories with other people in our family, not with us as the kids.
You mentioned that there were a lot of things going on in your life, and you also mentioned that your paternal grandfather, passed away when you were 6 years old. What memories do you have of that passing?
Well, the memory I have is not the direct one, but it came from my cousin, who was the same age as me, because she remembered the year in which he passed away and kind of the circumstances, because they were then living in Hayward. We were in Berkeley, and she just remembered the commotion that was going on, and her dad having to come to Richmond. My grandparents lived in Richmond. We lived in Berkeley. My cousins lived in Hayward, and there was a lot of commotion going on. And then, his passing kind of was a shock, because it just kind of took place, really, really suddenly. And but I don't remember much about it, because my dad was always over at their house anyway. So it wasn't like he left all of a sudden to go over there. And I think, as my father retells the story, he was staying overnight there that night for some reason. And then his father kind of rolled over from the bed, and he had a heart attack, and he died. And I think my father didn't come back and I don't remember him coming back and telling us anything. Maybe he came back and talked to my mom, but maybe we were shielded as kids. I don't know, but what did also happen was, not long after my grandfather passed away, my grandmother tried to commit suicide. And I didn't know it at the time. I only found out later in my adult life that this is what happened. And so my dad had to kind of go into this, very stressful mode of keeping an eye on my grandmother, and spending a lot of time over there, And on the other hand, for my cousin, I think in her family situation, she was witnessing her dad, having to take trips, from Hayward to Richmond. For me, it was like that was already my dad's routine. He was always over there. But he never told us what happened, in terms of her trying to take her life. And so what that helped me understand later in my life was that there was a family crisis that took place, when I was about 6 years old. And that required my dad's attention over at my grandmother's place quite a bit. And he was working out in Richmond at the time. And so he would often go there during lunch. I think he would go there and bring her lunch, and then check up on her. And then after work, he would go over and check up on her again. he'd often call back home, and we were eating dinner at home. And then I remember, my mom getting a phone call during dinner time, and they talked for a couple of minutes. But I didn't think much of it, except that, he was working hard and he was over at his mother's place. So, but I didn't know the details of the story until much later.
And that maternal grandmother who you mentioned tried to commit suicide, when her husband passed away in the late 50s, from what you said, she lived to be like another 40 years past that.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm curious about language. Did your grandmother speak English?
Yeah, she spoke English, and she was pretty good at it too. I mean, it was broken English, but she could get by in conversations. And my dad would say that, like in the restaurant, for example, she spoke good enough English that she could be a hostess as people came in, and kind of have these conversations with customers, and people really liked her, and she was really good in terms of connecting with people. And I don't know about my grandfather's English. I think he also spoke English, but my dad tells a story that my grandmother used to read the newspaper to my grandfather in English, because that was a way for her to practice her English and also inform him of the news that was going on.
What about your maternal family, with the ones that had immigrated to the United States? Were they also fluent in English?
Their English was, my grandfather's English was not as fluent, although he spoke English, and my grandmother's also was not totally fluent, although she, like when I communicated with her, it was really, how should I say, what she's saying, but she's not being totally clear in English. Somebody else might not understand what she's saying, in other words. I think that's a common phenomenon I think a lot of us have with parents who are primarily monolingual, that we understand their English, but others don't.
And for you, what was the language that you grew up speaking at home?
English, and we spoke very little Japanese. My parents were conversant in both Japanese and English, but not fluent. But they didn't speak Japanese at home. But at family gatherings, they would be speaking Japanese to the grandparents. And sometimes it would be kind of a hybrid, Japanese and English, but they were able to converse in Japanese with them. But they didn't teach us Japanese at home.
Why do you think that was?
I think it was a combination of a couple of things. One, convenience. It was just kind of hard to do that. And two, you notice, like, my name is Michael Arthur Yoshii. A lot of my friends had Japanese middle names. My parents kind of didn't give us Japanese middle names on purpose. And I think that was to not make us stand out, and not draw attention to being Japanese per se. I think that kind of was the explanation, when I first asked the question, like, where's my Japanese middle name, and they said, well, we thought it wouldn't be a good thing, for you. Plus, I was also named after a baseball player, so a minor league player in the Pacific Coast League in Oakland or something like that.
That's great. In the context of learning family history and sharing stories, I'm curious about whether your grandparents' mixed English and Japanese was a hindrance for you to be able to connect with them and hear these stories, since you didn't grow up speaking Japanese.
Well, I think in retrospect, if we knew Japanese, our connection would have been much stronger. That's for sure. But I think our connection is it is what it is, or it was what it was. And I think, my grandmother on my dad's side eventually came to live with them in El Cerrito. So I used to come and see her and visit her there. And she was quite a character. Even though she had limited English, she had quite a sense of humor, and she loved to joke around and stuff. So whenever I'd come to see her later, when I was in ministry, she'd come in, and I'd come into the bedroom where she was laying in bed, and she'd tell me, "Oh, it's the preacher boy. Are you going to come preach to me today? Are you going to come and tell me something?" But she just had this great sense of humor about things, and I just remember those times when she was there at the home, it was a nice thing for, I think, for the family, for my dad. And now I can understand in retrospect why it was so important for her to come live with 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 them, and she'd be right there, in the same household.
Yeah, I can.
But
I mean,
but I think that was long after, the crisis had taken place, many years after.
I'm sure that memory of that crisis, having lost his father, been there in the house when it happened, and then having nearly lost his mother,
Yeah,
it would leave an impression of wanting to make sure you're taking care of your mother.
yeah, absolutely.
Do you mind if we pause for a moment?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for sharing some of these family stories here, Michael. I'm curious about your own experience. So you were born in early 1950s, and your parents, you said, moved to Berkeley. How was it that they made this transition from living in Richmond to their home in Berkeley?
Well, my mother's parents, my Sakamoto grandparents, bought a home in Berkeley on Channing Way. And I think it was my uncle Henry who was also with them, and somehow they purchased the home. So they were already there, is my understanding. And then my parents were able to buy a home across the street from them. And I don't know exactly when they moved there. It could have been in 48 when they got married. But they were there when I was born in 52. And so I think it was from about 48 on, 1948 on, that they established a home there. And he was able to get a GI loan and able to be able to purchase a home.
Oh, that's great. What was it that your father's service entailed? Does he ever?
He was a courier in France, between France and Belgium. So he would talk about riding a train to bring communication information to different people back and forth. He said it was an interesting job, but he didn't talk much about. I mean, he said it was pretty routine, and not much else he really talked about there.
So yeah, so he was able to secure a GI loan. My understanding of Berkeley at that time was there was still very strict redlining as to.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Did that shape where your grandparents and eventually your parents could live?
I never thought about it, but I mean, that's obvious that there's certain places they couldn't live. I mean, later on, I got involved in housing advocacy work and kind of understood the whole history of housing discrimination. So, and we know in Berkeley, in every city, in the East Bay Area had their own redlining going on. And I've never talked with them about the circumstances under which they were looking for homes and why Berkeley versus other places. My uncle moved from Richmond to Hayward. They bought a place in Hayward, and I've never had the conversation with them about why they chose Hayward versus Berkeley and so forth.
What was it that people did for work in the wake of the war?
After the war?
Yeah,
my father got a job. It was kind of government connected. It was like an office job over in San Francisco. And he said that a couple of his friends in the Richmond, I think it was in the Richmond projects, they commuted together. And I think he drove, but he didn't like it. So he didn't stay with that. And he ended up getting into the produce industry. He said he liked working with his hands and kind of moving around and stuff. And so the produce industry was very important because farmers were connected to the produce industry. There were Japanese Americans within the produce industry in the East Bay. And so people, of course, there was still anti-Japanese sentiment after the war. And so it wasn't that easy to find jobs for people. And you had to find jobs where people had relationships. And so he gravitated to the produce industry. My uncle said he got a job at the Naval Air Station in Alameda. And then later with the post office, I believe he worked for many years. And so government jobs were other places where people were able to find employment as well.
Did either of your grandparents find work after the war?
My grandfather on my mother's side, my Sakamoto grandfather, he became a gardener. And so he had a little pickup truck and had different clients that he went to gardening. My grandmother was a domestic worker, and she worked for a woman up in the Berkeley Hills doing housekeeping. On my dad's side, I think my grandfather did some domestic work after the war, but again, he passed away in '58. And so he never started up, his business again. That was for sure. And I don't think my grandmother may have done some domestic work, but not for long. But they saved up their money, and so I think they had kind of money set aside for themselves. One interesting job was my other uncle on my Sakamoto side, Henry Sakamoto. They lived across the street from us, and then they ended up moving to Hayward, and he opened up a box business. So he got a flatbed truck, and he would come later on when we moved to El Cerrito, he'd come pick me up on Saturday morning with my cousin, and we'd go with him on a route where we'd pick up boxes that were produce boxes that were used by different folks, but he would get them for free, and then he and my cousin and I would load the boxes on the truck. We would tie it up, and then he had a little work yard out in Hayward where we would redo the boxes. We'd fix the boxes, and then he'd have them to go back and deliver back to the stores. So we would joke that he had hardly any overhead. He had free labor, and that was his entrepreneurship that he developed there.
And connected, as you mentioned, to the produce industry.
Exactly,
yeah,
exactly, because he had the connections of the people who were in the produce industry who would say, "Yeah, we'll leave the boxes for you out here," instead of throwing them away somewhere.
That's great.
So the original recycling.
That's right. Use and reuse.
Yeah.
Well, you're starting to tell some stories about your childhood in Berkeley. I'd love to hear more. What was the environment like that you grew up in?
So we lived on 6th and Channing in West Berkeley. The environment was predominantly Black community. So I was like, one thing that's very memorable is that I was probably one of two only non-Black students from kindergarten all the way up to 5th grade. So I was there up until the 5th grade before we moved to El Cerrito. And so there was kids in the neighborhood we played with, and I don't really remember a whole lot about the school itself. Just kind of no jarring memories at all.
What was that school?
It was called Columbus School, and it's been renamed now. I can't remember what they renamed it, but it's something other than Columbus. So it was probably renamed way back before the recent phenomena of renaming monuments and so forth. Because I think Berkeley at that particular time was doing more progressive things like that. But we also, like my grandmother's house across the street, I mentioned before, was kind of a hub of activity there. And they were very involved in their church. We belonged to the Christian Layman Church, which was in South Berkeley. It was not in the immediate neighborhood. So we had to drive there to get to church. But it was a Japanese American congregation out of the Uchimura Kanzo tradition from Japan, which is lay oriented.
What does that mean?
It was lay oriented, so they didn't have like hired pastors or clergy. So it was all run by the lay people. And my grandparents were a significant part of that first generation leadership. And so they always seemed to have like people over after church on Sundays, and there was like a lot of activity going on there, which was kind of fun, I think. And then the church itself was an extension for me of community life, because it was like a gateway into another our ethnic community as Japanese Americans.
Yeah, which it sounds like you didn't have in your neighborhood except for across the street.
There may be one or two other Japanese American families in the like 5-block radius for us. There was a family that lived in another part of Berkeley that was good friends of us, and he used to come on Saturday mornings and pick us up to go play baseball over at San Pablo Park, which is kind of another part of Berkeley. And he was in the produce industry, so he had a produce truck, and he would come and honk the horn on Saturday mornings. We'd jump in the back of his truck, and he, maybe a dozen or so kids he'd pick up, and we'd go play baseball over at the park. It was a lot of fun.
So it sounds like your grandparents had their church community as a way of building bridges with other Japanese Americans, and sports, it sounds like, was a way for you, or sports and church.
Yeah, and I think that, in retrospect, and as people have done studies around the resettlement time, that churches and temples, Christians and Buddhist temples were very important places for resettlement and kind of reestablishing a sense of community together, and for people to be together with people that either they've already known or people that they're getting to know after the war, kind of for mutual support and sustenance. And my uncle once told me the story that when they came back, he remembered staying at the Buddhist temple for several days before they went to Richmond. So there was a temple in Oakland that was a hostel. Open up their space as a hostel for returning families.
Hearing some of these experiences with church makes me wonder about holidays as a youth. What are some of your memories of holidays and maybe food associated with it?
Yeah, well, as Christians, we celebrated major holidays of Christmas and Easter, of course. And my grandmother would be the host. She was kind of like the matriarch of the Sakamoto family. And so most of our extended family would come over. It'd be more like potluck, people bringing their favorite dish. And I think like over time, we began to understand that the cooking in our family was kind of more the country cooking. And it was actually kind of more survival kind of food, I think. I don't know. It wasn't like your high culture that I would get exposed to later in my life. That's when you realize where you came from. It's like a kind of different social location, even within the Japanese American community.
Because that's where she grew up, in that southwestern province, right?
Right. And I remember one story where my mom was watching a PBS documentary on TV, and I can't remember the filmmaker, but it was a film about life out on a farm. And she called me up and she says, "Hey, you always asking me about what was life like for you there. Watch this." And so I turned on the PBS, and there were like kids gathering around a little fire, and they were sitting on wooden boxes, and they were making rice over the fire, and also cooking whatever they could. I guess vegetables from the farm, and they were very poor. I mean, they were like in rag clothes, and she said that's what it was like, and it was something where to see it visually that she could never describe to me, or put it to words, so to speak. And it was really gripping to me to see that. So the realization that they came from poverty, and my father's side came from sort of an entrepreneurship background. So by the time the war came, I think they were surviving, they were making money, but he didn't come here with a lot of money, and it wasn't like he was coming from Japan with capital venture money.
Yeah, survival. You'd mentioned that with holidays, Christmas and Easter. I've also, other Japanese Americans I've spoken to in this project have talked about boys' days and girls' days, and New Year's being a traditional
That's right. Yeah, I totally forgot New Year's. New Year's was a major thing. So New Year's was probably bigger than Christmas and Easter.
Really?
Yeah, New Year's was a bigger deal because it seemed like there would be other people that would come and visit on New Year's Day. And later when I'd become a pastor and then I'd be in the congregation was primarily Japanese Americans, New Year's was a big celebration for people to visit each other on New Year's Day and people hosting each other. But Boys' Day, Girls' Day, we didn't. Our family didn't celebrate those events prominently at all.
Are there any particular memories around Christmas or Easter that stand out for you?
I think one around Christmas was as kids, we would gather around the Christmas tree and we'd all get a little envelope with a crisp $1 bill in it. And it was from the patron that my grandmother worked for, the woman she kept house for up in the Berkeley Hills. So I remember, having this imagination about wondering what her house looked like, but it was up in the hills, places where we didn't venture into. But each of us
bills in her house.
But each of us as kids would open up that envelope and the George Washington, and we'd show each other our bill, but they were all equal because they were all like, so it was almost like she printed the bills.
But and the woman that your mother or grandmother worked for, is that
my grandmother? Yeah.
And that was, the hills was a distant land to you.
Yeah.
Hills.
Yeah. I mean, we were as far west in Berkeley as you could imagine, and then she worked somewhere up there in the hills on the other side of Berkeley.
Hmm. You'd mentioned that in 1963, your family moved to El Cerrito.
Correct.
What was the impetus for that move? And then how did your social and racial environment, how did that change?
Over time, I began to understand the impetus for the move. Partly, I think, was for us for better education and for them to seek a different kind of lifestyle per se, and I think as we've talked about where they were able to get a place in Berkeley, this is the next step up probably for them in terms of purchasing another home with the equity that they had developed. But it was also a practical thing because my grandmother lived in Richmond, and as I've shared about my dad's vigilance about taking care and looking out for her, moving in that direction meant that it'd be much more convenient for him in terms of his commute to work, and then also convenience to be close to my grandmother. So El Cerrito turned out to be sort of the ideal place. But what I understood about it too was that the year that we moved there was 63, and that was the year that the Rumford Act was passed in California in terms of housing discrimination, kind of eliminating housing discrimination. And but that law was debated for a couple of years before the federal law was passed in 68, barring housing discrimination. But my dad would tell me these stories about the fact that when they went looking for houses in El Cerrito, there were certain places the realtor wouldn't take them to. And it was kind of understood why, because Japanese weren't accepted or allowed in terms of the de facto situation. And the neighborhood that we moved into, there were already 2 Japanese American families living on the kitty corner there, which is kind of interesting thing to remember, because I remember my parents out on the front of their homes talking with them kind of the week that we moved in, and so I don't know exactly what they were talking about, but I can imagine that they were welcoming us to the neighborhood, and that my dad was probably asking questions about things to look out for and be mindful of. So,
Yeah, it sounds like they were with the term pioneering a neighborhood.
yeah.
And in the neighborhood, from my understanding, again, you said the Columbus Elementary School was majority Black. And
Right.
what was the environment like in El Cerrito?
El Cerrito, so there were those 2 Japanese American families, but then I think the majority of the community was white, of course. And I think El Cerrito was broken up into different kind of areas. And just like in Berkeley, there was the hill area. So we weren't in the hill area, but we were kind of more we weren't in the west portion of it, but we were kind of in the flatlands. And it was a developing suburb, the area. I was welcomed into the neighborhood by a bully. I was summer of 63. I would have been entering the 6th grade that fall, and in that summer I was welcomed into the neighborhood by a bully who was in the 9th grade. I found out later, and so he wrestled me to the ground on my neighbor's lawn and put his knees on my shoulders, and then he just started to beat the heck out of me, punching me in the chest over and over again, and yelling at me, telling me, you Chinaman, you can't go back to where you came from. And he just kept yelling that at me. And the neighbor lady came out and said, "Are you guys okay?" And he whispered in my ear, he says, "If you don't say anything to her. If you say anything, I'm going to kill you." And I was just kind of frozen and kind of motionless, so to speak. And he just kind of went on and continued to beat me up. And I can't remember how it happened, but he relented at some point, and I got up and I ran home. And that was kind of a story I didn't even tell my parents. I didn't tell them what happened or anything. I just kind of kept it to myself.
That was your entrance into this white neighborhood.
Yeah. And I didn't realize it in the moment, but later on, as I began to understand racial dynamics of the country and civil rights movement and such, that I heard about his background, that he was a Southern migrant. So he was sort of representative of the Southern racism that people were encountering, in the civil rights movement. He wasn't necessarily representative of the whole neighborhood, because there were Southern migrants to the neighborhood, but not everybody was of that ilk per se, and not necessarily indicative of how other neighbors were. But that was my introduction. And And it was pretty clear to me later in life that I was traumatized by that experience. And I was pretty numbed out. And it affected my interactions with white folks, later in life, probably from that period on, and carrying different feelings of fear of white folks as well as anger against them. And depending upon the kind of interactions I would have, things would get triggered for me.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if I experienced someone with a look of his face, I would keep my distance and, kind of walk in another direction. Or if I would have to encounter someone, that had the same kind of demeanor, it's this kind of thing where you're not thinking about it consciously, but I began to understand that, that I had that experience at that age. And then also like that period, I was heading into 6th grade. So that period in life where you're exploring different things, I think it probably affected me in different ways. That period in my life was marked by that. There were kind of scars that I had from that experience.
You would have changed to a different school from Columbus School. Where in 6th grade did you begin?
Yeah, so I started 6th grade in the fall at a school called Castro School, which was the elementary school. And back in those days, these schools went from K to 6th grade. So the 6th grade was not middle school as it is now in many school districts. So I was entering into a new school, and school was really, really nice, really clean, compared to like where I'd gone in Berkeley. And one thing that made an impression on me was my 6th grade teacher was an Asian. His name was Mr. Chin. And I just, I don't know how much of a impression, it made an impression on me, of course, but later on, I would think that must have been a big deal in 1963 to have an Asian teacher at a school like that, and kind of for the times as well. So, but it did make an impression on me to have an Asian role model.
Yeah, I would, especially after this experience with a bully. I mean, I imagine moving to a school that was majority white after getting beaten up by this white kid in your neighborhood at school. Yeah, I'd be very hesitant.
Yeah, and I look back on it now. So I was like entering into this new terrain, new territory, and the culture that I had come from in the neighborhood that I grew up in was very different from this one. And so there were things that I was learning. Everything was new to me, and it was very different, very different.
What do you mean by that?
Well, just the way you do things and the way you talk and so forth. And so, and kids that I would meet would make fun of me because I talk different, and the way that I talked, the way that I walked, and things of that nature. But it didn't really bother me. I didn't feel like that was discriminatory. It's just that I knew I was coming from a different place, but and I was entering into new place. I just didn't know what I didn't know.
Yeah, the social and racial environment that you were in the East Bay, this sounds so dynamic. Mm-hmm. For the mixture of your Black elementary school, the majority white school, the mixture of Japanese American connections that you have, especially through church, it just seems like a really an interesting mix in the East Bay.
The other thing that was memorable to me in my first year at Castro School was when President Kennedy was assassinated. I just really remember that day, just being the sort of ominous feeling.
How did you learn about it?
Well, there was an announcement over school that the president has been killed and that we're going to close school for the day. And so, everybody, was told to go home. And I don't know how many days we closed. It may have just been that one day, but I just remember walking home and I was like, I was like looking out in the sky and stuff. And it just felt like something really deep. And it opened up for me like questions about the world we're living in and like what's going on. And that I guess I felt some intuition, like there was something much larger than what's being talked about, and so I really got into like conspiracy theories about the killing of Kennedy and, kind of followed those writings and for a period of time. And I look back on it now because there was something bigger going on. It wasn't just sort of some accidental thing. There was a lot happening, and I do feel like it was sort of an opening of my consciousness, sort of a social political consciousness in a way. Although I didn't have many answers in front of me, it was just sort of this sort of opening in my psyche around that.
I want to ask about this transition in the wake of Kennedy's death in '63. At the end of your sixth grade, you do make a transition into junior high.
Right.
What was that like, and how was junior high different for you?
Junior high, I think what happened in junior high was I started playing basketball, and I started gravitating to kids who played basketball at school. And I think during, it was recesses or PE times, I would gravitate to kids playing basketball. I liked playing. I was learning how to play. And then I had friends, it was more interracially. I had one black friend who was really good at basketball, and then two white friends who we kind of hung out for a while. But what I reflect on in those terms is that was also space where we had conversations about race, because my black friend's father was involved in the civil rights movement, and he was pretty well versed in what was going on. So he would kind of tell us things and kind of educate us here and there. And then the white friends were from Texas, and they were new also. So they were looking to find people to hang out with. So we were all kind of new, and we kind of found each other through sports, through basketball in particular. And as we'd play, sometimes we'd have conversations about different things. And the white kids I really connected with, maybe in retrospect, it's because they were from the South and they were white, but they were what I would call informed, enlightened white folks, because they could talk about the racism that they experienced, seeing from where they came from, and be somewhat, I don't know what the word might be, confessional about it, And I felt really good about being able to talk with them about certain things in that nature. And my black friend first introduced me to the phrase Uncle Tom, and then I made up my own phrase for Uncle Shoji, which is like equivalent of a Japanese American who wants to be white, so I just remember that time as being kind of a fertile grounds for us having these conversations. But we also kind of knew we were in different worlds too. That my black friend, he had his black community and families, and the white kids had their own, and I did as well. Because that was the time I was also introduced to basketball program at the church that I belonged to in Berkeley, which was all Japanese American sports league. And so that was a whole different dynamic as well.
What was that all Japanese American sports league like for you?
Well, it was like kind of an extension of, how I mentioned the church was kind of a different place of community for us as a family. So this was even more so, because we had a team at our church, and then we played against teams from other churches and Buddhist temples in the East Bay area. So then I was starting to meet kids from other places in the East Bay and other churches, and then experiencing this whole dynamic of the whole community of Japanese Americans, and it was a lot of fun. I like playing basketball and meeting, you're meeting new people, but it's also kind of a whole sub-ethnic world that you are a part of, and in retrospect, it's kind of invisible, because it's not like there was a J-town like there was in San Francisco. There was not a specific place that you would say, here's where the Japanese Americans are all living. Because there are pockets of people living throughout the East Bay, and also people connected to different churches and temples.
But they all came together through a sports network.
Yeah. And so over time, you go to practice on Friday night, you'd have games maybe on a Saturday or Sunday, and you'd see all these other Japanese Americans there at the gym, And it was like people, you could just tell people loved it. Families loved it, because they're there supporting their kids. And you can imagine today where I don't know, like soccer leagues where you see families coming and descending on a soccer field, and they're all very into it, right? Families are into supporting their kids. But think about that, except in basketball, in a gymnasium where the whole place is packed with people.
Yeah, and to not have a community hub beyond the church itself, but for the whole region, that seems like a way of stitching the ethnic community together regionally.
Yeah.
What did that do for your social life then?
Well, I think for my social life, obviously, then a big portion of time was spent in that social reality of the Japanese American, community, invisible community is the way I would call it. And then, you have your school events and things going on too. But I think primary energy was spent there, because weekends would be, with this particular set of community, and your school time is with your school friends. I also played baseball too in Japanese baseball league. So it was the same kind of thing, except that the teams were sponsored not by churches, but by different organizations that were specifically Japanese American. So, you know, you have your baseball season, then you have your basketball season. So you kind of cover it around the year.
It's such a dynamic mix that I'm hearing, like the social and racial integration in some ways, but also segregation in other ways.
Right. And what I would later come to understand too, particularly as I was pastoring, was that sports leagues were very important in camp. And sports was important in camp because it helped sort of normalize life. And my grandfather on my father's side really loved going to see the baseball games that were organized in camp. And there were segregated leagues before camp as well. There were segregated, particularly baseball leagues and basketball leagues as well. And so there was some continuity of that into the camp life. And then post-camp life, I think sports was another kind of anchor for people to gather and community together, particularly where you're supporting children and young people. And that seems to be kind of a legacy prior to camp, and then through camp, and then post-camp life, that sports becomes a space for anchoring of community, and then the bonding of relationships that people have and continue to cultivate for themselves.
I want to ask about learning about the World War II mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, what the experience of your parents and grandparents, and how you learned about that. Is now an okay time to transition to that?
Yeah. Well, it was actually in junior high school. Portola Junior High was where I went to junior high school, and there was a girl in one of the classes who was Japanese American, and she shared with other Japanese Americans about the camps and doing education about that. And I think she belonged to the junior JACL, Japanese American Citizens League. I think her family was probably very involved in Japanese American Citizens League, and so she was part of the junior JCL. And so she told, you know, she was sharing some literature information about it. And when I looked at that, was the first time I really heard about the existence of the camps. And of course, I went home and asked my parents about it. And there was a little bit of discomfort in terms of their reaction to my, bringing the subject up. And we didn't get really far with the conversation at that particular time. And I think that sort of made me angry to learn about this history that I had never been told about, And so, but it was sort of the beginning of that kind of conversation.
How did you internalize your parents' reactions?
I don't know if I think back about it, I could tell like something was not right here, but because they didn't talk a lot about things, I didn't know what was missing, and I'm thinking back about it now, just in this moment, that I don't recall, going on some search to get the history. I don't remember that. Maybe because I was too busy playing basketball. I don't know, but it's just my awareness was there of the camps.
Yeah. Did your awareness of the camps have any impact on your social environment? I mean, here I'm picturing you in your in junior high as a time of self-identity, and you're coming into your own, and you're in this dynamic racial environment, this new white community that you're now have moved to. You spent so much time in a Black community. The basketball friends that you have outside of the church sports leagues is very much mixed. And then you're also spending a lot of time in a specifically Japanese American ethnic community with the sports league. So I'm wondering if the ways that you learned about camp at this time is such a rich time in your life too, of self-development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there wasn't like one moment or period where I'm learning more and more about the camp's experience itself, except that this becomes information that is common knowledge to me at that point in time in my life. And I think incrementally, I would begin to learn a little bit more and more about things, particularly as I had more conversations, with my parents. But it wasn't like, I don't remember myself at junior high always coming and saying, okay, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. That wasn't the case. I was like off doing my thing, you know, and, you know, part of it was like playing basketball, having friends and doing things that junior hires do, I think.
Yeah.
But I do think I internalized some of their stories in terms of the camps, because I can't remember details. My father was much more vocal about saying things, but he would also get angry a lot when he started to talk about it. And sometimes he'd get angry and walk out of the room, you know, and I'd go, oh, you know. My mother was very quiet. She would hardly say anything about it. And, you know, except that it was the best thing for us. And, you know, and then, you know, I'd get mad at her, like, what do you mean it's the best thing for you? And I think incrementally over time, you know, I absorbed the fact that this was part of our community history and it was part of my identity in a certain way. But I think the watershed moment was when I was in 10th grade, when I was in high school, and Martin Luther King got assassinated in it was April 1968. And I was in an English class, and the teacher was facilitating conversation about the killing of King and how tragic it was. And I spoke up in the class and said something to the nature of like, you know, oh, and the backdrop of it too was that there was a lot of looting that was going on. And along San Pablo in West Coast Cerrito and into Richmond, a lot of businesses got trashed because there were protests and looting that was taking place. And my father's store, I think, may have gotten damaged too. And I don't know exactly how I got this voice in my heart, in my mind, but I spoke up in class. I said, you know, why can't the blacks just like suck it up and, you know, work hard and quit complaining about things, you know, and like the Japanese Americans did, you know, because we were put in camps and like, look at us now. I mean, people are working hard and making money and surviving, you know. And so my English teacher, you know, responded to me and says, wait a minute, you're totally wrong here. And you cannot compare the experience of Japanese Americans and what happened in wartime with the legacy of slavery in the Black community. They're totally different things. There's commonalities, but they're different things. And I was like taken aback and, you know, embarrassed in front of the class and all that. But it really spoke to me in the ways that I didn't understand, you know, the comparison between the two or this narrative that I was spinning. And I think I was bringing the narrative that kind of was coming to me from whatever I was exposed to up to that particular time. And it made a difference, you know, in my life. And, you know, it was still kind of the camps were still a pivotal piece of our history. But I think I began to understand that it wasn't the same as slavery. You know, they were totally different. There was a history of slavery, and then there was also more history to what happened with the mass incarceration as well, that I didn't know about because we weren't learning about it in school.
You said it made a difference for you. I'm wondering in what ways. Part of what I'm hearing you say is you had internalized the myth of the model minority, and then spoken that during this classroom conversation in the wake of King's murder. And you said that it affected you. You took that critique that the English professor, your English teacher said, like, they're different. You need to educate yourself. In what ways did you carry that forward?
Well, I began to really kind of gravitate more toward understanding Black history. And so for whatever reason, I was drawn to the Nation of Islam and to Black Muslims. And I think because in the East Bay, there were a lot of Black Muslim bakeries and places where you could actually go in and buy some baked goods and then get the Nation of Islam newspaper. And I started reading that. Somehow I got a copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X. That was later on in life, I think, that autobiography came out. But I think it was probably through the Nation of Islam that I was reading about Malcolm X. And then the Black Panthers were very prominent in the East Bay at that particular time. And I would pick up literature from them as well. And so I just sort of gravitated toward different narratives of the Black community and history. And as somebody involved in sports, I really loved Muhammad Ali and kind of was following his career and the things that he was saying. And so I was getting much more educated as the English teacher was challenging me to do on the Black history and what's really that's all about. So I think I began I started to begin to form this implicit solidarity with Black community in a different way that I'd already had, because I had had, you know, a Black friend and the white friends that we had talked about race issues with, but it was getting to a much more sophisticated place, you know, being in high school. And it wasn't until I think when I went to college and I was at UC Berkeley and taking the Asian Studies class that I got more immersed also into Asian American history as well. Because I wasn't, frankly speaking, I wasn't learning a lot about Asian American history in high school. And we weren't learning a lot about the camp experience in high school. That wasn't part of the curriculum. So, you know, and it was very piecemeal, what I was learning and understanding, so forth.
You attended high school, I assume, it was in El Cerrito,
Mm-hmm.
and from 1966 to 1970. And that is such a rich time in the history of the East Bay, particularly with the rise of the Panthers, the Black Panthers movement. Mm-hmm. And to hear you talk that you were exposed to literature, I'm just curious about other memories you have, because it's so regionally specific and so historic, mm-hmm. of your engagement around what the Black Panthers were doing in the East Bay.
Mm-hmm. Well, just the awareness that they were organizing and having rallies and things of that nature. And, you know, if you were anywhere around things, you know, the people would be passing out literature about what the Panthers were and what they were doing, you know, their breakfast things for kids. And, you know, and then, you know, you start following the news and you start seeing kinds of stereotypes that are being portrayed, and particularly, you know, like with the Panthers, you can tell that there's a media narrative that's trying to tag them as being, you know, the bad guys and the violent, the people, whereas they're speaking about defending themselves, and they had no apologies about being armed to defend themselves against police brutality. Or, you know, the Nation of Islam, the things that I was very interested in, and it's interesting to wonder why at that point in my life, but maybe it's because I had this inclination toward religion. But, you know, to hear the words of Elijah Muhammad and speak about, you know, why they needed this Nation of Islam and the ways they spoke explicitly about the Black experience in the context of this Islamic religion, you know, and then, you know, how deep, you know, as you begin to read, you know, things from Malcolm X and hear what he's saying, you know, riveting speeches that he's making as you get kind of recordings of them. I don't remember, I mean, like Malcolm X was assassinated in the 60s too, 65, I think it was, right?
Yeah, 65, 66, somewhere
yeah, there. Yeah. So, I mean, there was a lot there. I would learn much more later on, you know, as I was in college and just even later on in life as well, more details about some of the dynamics of what was going on with Malcolm X and with Elijah Muhammad and that kind of sector of the movement, you know, versus what was happening with Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the South. But those became kind of points of information that there was kind of I don't know, it's kind of what became learning over a period of time about some of that.
Well, in terms of learning, you had mentioned that you went on to college. What was the step from El Cerrito High School in 1970 when you graduated high school to college for you?
What do you mean the step?
What was it? What were you thinking whenever you graduated high school?
You know, for our family, I don't think there were high expectations about higher education, that if we went to college, that would be great. My brother had already gone and enrolled in UC Berkeley. And I think he was already done because he was in the National Guard, I think, when I started. But UC Berkeley was the place to go. And I didn't really even shop around for other colleges. It was almost like, for me, it was like the community college, because it was not that hard to get into at that particular time. And compared to today, tuition wasn't exorbitant. And so it's just sort of like something that was sort of an unspoken expectation. Go to college, get a degree, and then hopefully, you know, that'll advance you in your life. But I realized later on that my parents, they didn't have college experience, so they didn't have that in their minds to prep us and think about things the way, you know, the way that we're consumed with that with our kids and try to help advise them about the best route to take for education and so forth. And in other words, they weren't recipients of that higher education in ways that would sort of inform and direct us for our lives, at least for me. And so I just sort of went to Berkeley kind of as sort of an expectation to get a college education, and didn't really think about what I was doing, or didn't have any particular educational aspirations or goals. But they began to get formulated as I enrolled in school. And
What kind of classes did you take? Were you interested in?
well, so what I did, this is what I did. I went through the catalog and went through courses that I thought I would be interested in, and I tried to match it with whatever major would be closest. And it turned out to be criminology. But the crim department was closed down that year in 1970. I can't remember exactly what the conditions were, why they closed, but so I couldn't major in crim, and I ended up majoring in social welfare. So I was, I was gravitating to courses that were very much, I guess, what you'd call sort of general sociology, psychology, education, and helping people, the kind of helping professions. So that's kind of what I was gravitating. But while I was there, I was developing an interest to go to law school. And there's maybe more of a romantic kind of romanticization of going into law, because there were other friends who were thinking of that too. Or people I was meeting, people were planning to go to med school or go to law school. So I kind of latched onto that idea. And I took a course in Asian studies about Asians and the law, and that kind of got me interested in that. But after undergraduate school, I did work in a alternative legal justice program.
After college, you mean?
After college, yeah, and that experience kind of turned me away from pursuing law school. I went there actually to volunteer to get more experience, and there was actually a position open, and I applied for it. I got it, and it was working with first-time offenders and also ex-offenders. Around helping people resettle and get jobs. But I just didn't like the legal system. I had to go to court every day and kind of be there in conversations with judges and public defenders and district attorneys and things. And I just didn't take to it. And it kind of soured me from the idea of going to law school. So kind of paused on that.
Yeah. Something we haven't talked about yet, but I feel like I'd be remiss not to ask, is your experience with regard to the Vietnam War. I mean, from 65 through the early 70s, this time where you're in high school and in college, in the Berkeley area, just such a dynamic space for anti-war movement, let alone the rise of ethnic studies and taking classes in Asian American consciousness and all of that happening. What was your experience vis-a-vis America's engagement in Vietnam?
Yeah, and so I think in high school, I probably wasn't that conscious or didn't have much conversations about the Vietnam War. But once I got into Berkeley, that kind of just was really in front of me, because there was a lot of anti-war protests going on, and I started joining some of them. And I think it was probably both through being involved in Asian studies classes and also, beginning to formulate an understanding of this particular war, a war in Asia, upon Vietnamese people. I always loved what Muhammad Ali was saying. I got nothing against those Vietnamese, because they did nothing to me, but I got issues here in this own country, because people are holding me back here. But for us as Asians, looking at what was going on in Vietnam, I think just was there was a visceral reaction to that particular incursion into Vietnam. So there, so I think, coupled with sort of a growing Asian American consciousness, and then the war being part of that as well, I think sort of opened me up into that arena of more anti-war protests.
From your junior high and high school experience engaged in the sports networks that was mostly Japanese American, to your studies in college of Asian American studies or Asian studies, that seems to me like a transition, a broadening.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah.
How did that play out then for the rest of your experience in college, and then after college, the choices you made for where you live and what you do for work?
I think, from college, I was just trying to find my way. And, like I say, I went to this particular job in the criminal justice system. And then from there, I was recruited to another job, another nonprofit that was working with Asian immigrants. It was called Asians for Job Opportunities in Berkeley. And they were servicing immigrants coming from Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, China, Korea, Philippines. And we had an ESL program in which they would learn vocational English. And then I was in the job development unit. So I was there doing work to try to help connect them with employers to find jobs for them as they came into the program. So that that work was really good because it was very practical around understanding some of the current immigration issues that were going on, and the challenge that they were facing as folks coming from these various countries. And it did also, for me, working there sparked another kind of internal reflection period for me, because as I was working with these immigrants, it started causing me to think about my own grandparents and what was it like when they were coming. We talked about it in Asian studies, but it was more like I was really asking myself like more about the details of their lives and their experiences coming into the country and the things that they encountered while they were struggling with things. And also it was maybe a period in my life where I was like stirred up to kind of my feelings about where the Japanese American community was at. And maybe it was sort of a synchronicity, because around that time, I think talks about redress and reparations were beginning to happen, and I didn't make a conscious connection with it at that time, but I was feeling this sense of, angst about where our Japanese community was at, and that there was like, the phrase I would use now, there was sort of a spiritual malaise, within our community. And even though I had fun, playing basketball, being in sports leagues and stuff, I think there was a feeling I had about this sort of spiritual malaise that was present in our community.
Can you share a little bit more about where you think that's coming from? I mean, I'm hearing you tell stories about your own trajectory of service, wanting to serve community, majoring in social welfare, taking this work in a criminal justice program, and then in this job placement unit for Asian immigrants that are coming in. Through that experience, where is it that you are seeing the spiritual malaise arise within Japanese Americans?
I think I use that term spiritual malaise now because I have the hindsight of using spiritual language. At the time, I probably didn't have that language. It's just something I felt, I was feeling inside. And I think it probably was that I was struggling with my Japanese American identity. I was like still, like when I was at UC Berkeley, you have Asian American Studies, and there was this sense of a political identity of being Asian American. But I always still felt that there was something peculiar to our experience as Japanese Americans that we weren't really addressing. In other words, our experience was not the same as these new incoming, refugees from Southeast Asia or those coming from China, and their experience is much more similar to my grandparents' experience of their immigration, but it was in a different era, right? So my experience as a third generation, here I was, the benefit of the sacrifices that my grandparents and my parents had made, and what was that legacy for me? I think those were the questions I was beginning to ask. And I think it was peculiar in a way. For me, I can, in reflection, understand that I was asking this existential question. Like, why was I born here as a Japanese American in this world? What am I supposed to do, with my life? And is my life supposed to be here to help, service new immigrants coming to this country? That, that was the job I was in, right? And I was asking myself the question, is this what I want to do the rest of my life? So it was probably more reflective of my internal process of finding myself. I was still kind of in that phase of life where I was finding who I was and kind of what I wanted to do or what I was called to do in this world. And I wasn't fixed in a particular profession. I just knew that I had left that idea of going into law. And I was in another job, just continuing to explore.
That's great. Do you mind if we pause for a moment?
Sure.
Michael, you had mentioned you were reflecting in your work experience with Asian immigrants about the existential question of your own life experience, especially in the context of being a Sansei third-generation Japanese American.
Mhm.
But from our many conversations in advance of your oral history, you've also shared that you went through a different kind of existential crisis around the same time in the mid-70s. What was that experience for you?
Yeah, at that same time, I was working with the immigrant population. A good friend of mine killed himself playing Russian roulette with a bunch of friends. And it was quite a shock to me. His father called me up the very next day, told me that he'd killed himself. And somehow I got into this autopilot mode of going over to them and helping them organize a memorial service for him. And I would later come to understand as I became a pastor that somehow there was this thing within me to know how to help families that were suffering from a loss, and put a lot of energy into helping them organize a service. And after that was over and kind of the adrenaline was gone from that event, I kind of went into my own depression and kind of realized over a period of time that I was kind of entering into this period of post-traumatic stress because there were things I couldn't do. We were friends, had played basketball together for several years, and I couldn't.
In the Japanese American League?
We had extended into like our college years, playing in the same leagues, except for older folks, and so I couldn't even go into a gymnasium. It was like there was an invisible wall. As I have my duffel bag and go to the gym, it's like I hit the wall and didn't know what was going on. And it just kind of went into a real tailspin in my life too. I had married my college girlfriend that year, and then our marriage, kind of was coming to an end, and a lot of it was due, I think, to my own depression and going into a tailspin in my life. But it also was a catalyst for me to begin spiritual exploration, because I started, again, asking these existential questions. I think in his passing, I think what happens to a lot of people is you have survivor's guilt. And I think I was experiencing some of that, like, why am I here? And why was he taken? And I would have, dreams of him come that would sort of sometimes be haunting to me. But then it opened up this sort of new question for me about existential reality and where did he go? Where is he now? What am I doing here in my life? And as a result of that, like dreams that I was having of him, I started to get into dream work and Jungian psychology, which, also has a sort of spiritual bent towards it in terms of spiritual consciousness and psychology. And from dream work, I was getting into different spiritualities, Tibetan Buddhism, which, kind of understands that, dreams are part of our cosmic reality. I was exploring meditation and Buddhism of all different forms, besides Tibetan Buddhism, Zen, and also gravitated toward Sufism, which is a mystical branch of Islam, and particularly around the healing aspects of sound and music. And I was taking a course, not taking a course, but I was studying with somebody some music around Indian ragas, which are the kind of the healing melodies that you can sing for any state of the soul that you might be in. And I really love that as well. But that process kind of was bringing me to this clarity that there was a spiritual search going on for me too. And it was my Sufi teacher who kind of led me back to Christianity, because I didn't want to touch Christianity at that time in my life. Because
I was going to ask you why. Because you grew up in this Christian environment, you had these great social networks. You mentioned your grandparents as church leaders, but
yeah,
the explorations through Sufism and Buddhism and Islam, it sounds like you were avoiding that.
I was avoiding it because of the social political identity that I had crafted for myself, and which had become more anti-Christian because of its colonial history and its imperialistic history, through the centuries, And so I really had an aversion to Christianity. But what he did was he brought me back into looking at Christianity by looking at hymns that I had grown up with that, you know, might be containers of spiritual energy for me. And so simple hymns that I'd grown up with in church, and began to look at them and revisit. And sure enough, I began to feel a reconnection to the faith in kind of, you know, incremental ways along the way. And then the efficacy of really understanding Jesus as a figure that was not necessarily one and the same as the institution of all the Christian institutions and denominations and so forth that went along with it. So I gradually was finding my way, but it wasn't like it all took place, you know, in one moment. There was a process that took place.
In that journey that you're on in the wake of your friend's accidental death, it sounds like there's a wrestling with emotion, trying to understand what it was you were feeling, and then trying to find some sort of spiritual outlet, the way that music and communion allows for an emotional uplift.
Yeah. At that time in my life, like he was 22 when he passed, I was 24. I had no language for grief. You know, I was not familiar with, you know, what's more popularized later around the Kubler-Ross stages of grieving, and I didn't have any language for grieving. And I wasn't raised in a way where you expressed your emotions, and for me, maybe just personality-wise, you know, was not somebody who was free to express my feelings and emotions. So there was a lot of pain I was carrying that I didn't know how to articulate or to express. And so that was part of the challenge that I was going through at that particular phase of my life. And, you know, it was really taking me to dark places, you know, internally. And it was really, really challenging. In spiritual terms, we might talk about it as being part of the dark night of the soul, that I was entering into this period where I was really you know, struggling with the darkness of life and also the darkness inside my soul as well.
The outlets that you did find to help wrestle through that dark night of the soul, the musical outlets and especially Sufism and the chanting. Tell me a little bit more about how you found your way through to the light.
Well, I think it was definitely a process. And I think I didn't realize I was on a spiritual search. I was just gravitating to things that were kind of helping me, you know, feel better. And dreams was really one vehicle for that, because I was having dreams about him, and where he was in my dreams, and then, you know, I'd have vivid dreams of other things. Then kind of exploring this whole phenomena of dream work, you know, beginning to write down your dreams and to understand kind of what the messages are in dreams. And in Jungian psychology, there's a whole methodology I'm sure you're familiar with around that. And the dream work kind of lends itself to your entrance into spiritual traditions. At that time, particularly with Tibetan Buddhism, and then with other traditions as well. And then just kind of picking up different tools for healing, I think, is what I was doing unconsciously, I guess, is what was happening.
You have shared with me in terms of dreams that there was a dream in particular that led to an Old Testament story. I'm wondering just about the context of that, what that story and the context that it came to you in.
The context of that was actually kind of simultaneous to my kind of having this period of self introspection and then spiritual search, was the Redress movement kind of beginning emerging. And then as I was thinking about the Japanese community and what was happening with the Japanese community, the questions that I had and feelings that I had about our spiritual melees, you know, in the community, I was trying to just reconcile the two around my personal spirituality and social justice. And then this dream came to me of this figure holding a scroll and saying, "You won't understand this until you read Ezekiel." And he opened up a scroll, and then there were like wheels or something like that in the dream imagery as well. And so at that particular time, I think I was already involved in the Redress movement, and I was doing outreach to churches and things. So I was doing outreach to churches I was asking people to consider coming to testify at the hearings. But at one church, I asked the pastor about the Ezekiel 37, and she says, "Oh, that's an Old Testament prophet," which, it wasn't like somebody I was familiar with. And so we started a Bible study, and we went all the way through the book until I got to chapter 37. And there's the very famous story of the Valley of the Dry Bones, where this prophet Ezekiel is put out into this valley where there's these dry bones of folks who have been killed in the exile. And he is called by God to speak to the dry bones, to breathe life into them. And so the words he uses is to breathe spirit into these dry bones and cause them to rise up and to come together bone to bone and connect once again. And so that was a story of spiritual resurrection of a community, in the Hebrew scriptures, that I immediately translated to my community of Japanese Americans. That's what we were doing. We were trying to breathe life into our community in a way that our community has a spiritual resurrection, and coming together bone to bone too. A very kind of clear feeling of collective spirituality, not just individual, personal spirituality.
God, what a powerful, and that came to you in a dream.
It came to me in a dream, but it didn't, but the meaning of it didn't come until later, when I actually read the text and read the story, and then, really appropriated it.
Yeah.
And, that text has been used often in many places around empowerment of communities, from a spiritual standpoint, and the power of collective spirituality as well, rising up, connecting to each other bone to bone.
The circular, the wheel imagery as well, it reminds me of Tibetan Buddhism and the wheel plays in Buddhism.
Yeah. And there's imageries of wheels within that particular chapter of Ezekiel.
You mentioned that the realization of the Ezekiel dream and what its meaning came from a Bible study after talking to a pastor as a part of your engagement with the Redress and Reparations movement. How was it that you got involved in Redress?
So after I was working at the place with the immigrant support issues, I was working with some folks in a project with Japanese Americans in the East Bay who were thinking about starting a community center there. And it was in that context that the Redress movement was beginning. And there was a group called National Coalition of Redress and Reparations, which was really doing the grassroots outreach and organizing in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so I connected with them and, signed up to volunteer to do outreach to families in the East Bay. And the churches and temples were kind of like the primary places for me to go and share information about what was going on with the Redress movement, also with the upcoming scheduling of the hearings, and then encouraging people and inviting people to come testify for the hearings.
Where were you at in your spiritual journey in dealing with this existential personal crisis, and then also your sense of this communal existentialism? Where were you at in that journey when you began engagement with Redress?
Well, I think, like many folks, social justice and spirituality kind of get bifurcated. And for me, they were beginning to come together, and the fact that there was this movement happening in my own community that was very viscerally connected, to me, bodily and spiritually and holistically, right? And I think what the challenge was blending my spiritual practices in with that activism, at that particular time. And it wasn't coming right away, but it would come, in the ensuing months and years.
You told earlier how when you first learned about the mass incarcerations during World War II and what happened to your mom and dad, when you brought it up with them, they had very different reactions and led to a lot of confusion, maybe, or questioning, uncertainty in your own experience. When you became engaged in Redress and began reaching out to these different Japanese American communities about this topic, I'm wondering how that played out in your family connections, in your family relations.
Yeah, so we sat down and talked about it because I told them that I was working on Redress. I explained to them what Redress was all about, and their interest was piqued, and then I asked them if they would want to testify. I told them I'm trying to outreach to different people and get families to testify, and and they both clearly know they don't think they could or would do that. I think we also asked my uncle, and he kind of hesitated too. But in the process of that, they began to share more about their experiences. And I think then our conversations about what had happened started to go deeper in terms of more of the salient details around things. And then I told them I'd like to testify then if you don't want to testify. And they said, that's fine. And they sort of blessed my participation in the hearings. And so I began to think about what I wanted to say. And part of what I gravitated toward was to talk about the psychological impacts of the camps and kind of what my perceptions was about, the fact that the Redress movement had been using a metaphor of we had been subjected to collective rape. Kind of for me intuitively, my feeling was if we've been collectively raped, we've been collectively wounded, but we haven't been able to heal from that. And hopefully this process will be one that's going to help that. But also there's much more to it than just this, thing about doing hearings or passing some legislation. If you think about the parallels to somebody, being victimized by rape. So that was kind of the focus I was gravitating toward in terms of testifying. And there were 3 days of hearings in San Francisco, and my parents came to all of them. My uncle came. I think my uncle came to sit with my parents, and so many people that I had known in the community came to the hearings. Of course, it was San Francisco Bay Area hearings, so it was kind of all over the metropolitan San Francisco area, and it was just so profound. I mean, the energy there of people. I think there were like 500 people in the room, and just the gripping testimonies from Iseis, from Niseis, and Sanseis like myself, and just you can feel people just listening to every word. And it was a very cathartic experience for me personally, but it was clearly a cathartic experience for our whole community. So the metaphor I was bringing over from the scripture of the spiritual resurrection, I really feeling that happening, and it was answering my existential question about my own life, and it didn't answer my purpose, but there was a reason I'm a Japanese American, and we're telling our story. It felt very powerful.
The hearings,
and also the hearings also kind of catapulted me into the spiritual direction that I began to move on vocationally, because I really felt for me personally, the hearings were a spiritual catalyst as much as it was a political tool for the passage of the Redress legislation, and that it kind of catapulted me into the direction, of going into seminary.
Well, we have about 15 minutes before our time today will come to a close. Do you want to continue to tell about that experience in that direction, or should we pause today to pick up that part?
Whatever you want to do, it's fine with me.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'd love to hear more about this experience of being at the Redress hearings in August in 1981, the Bay Area hearings, and just that energy that's in the room, because I'm so curious about your intergenerational experience, how you remember hearing Issei, Nisei, and then for yourself, Sansei testimonies, and how they were, and what ways they were different or similar.
Well, obviously the difference is that Issei that testified, it was being translated through their personal experiences, right? And the Nisei also had the personal experience of being incarcerated. For those of us at Sansei, we were coming after the fact, after the wartime experience had happened. For most Sansei that were testifying, and so, but I do think there was this positive dynamic in having Sansei testify, because it meant that there was an intergenerational presence in the room that the commissioners were hearing, and that also our community was feeling, this intergenerational solidarity around this particular issue. I think was a very strong feeling. And for me personally, it was like, and my voice mattered too. You know, my story in this, and it's a very small one in comparison to the larger narrative, but that it's a part of it. And I think that made a difference for me. You know, there was diversity of stories too that people were telling, because everybody had their own experiences. Everybody had their own family experiences. Everybody had their own different experiences pre-war and into the war. There were veterans, you know, as well. The one thing that was missing in the hearings was the voices of the resistors, the Heart Mountain resistors, who, you know, were put in jail. Many of them were in Leavenworth. In fact, later on, as I became a pastor, and I was involved in some different things, kind of follow-up efforts to redress, I would hear the stories of the Heart Mountain resistors from one of my own members, who had a brother who was a resistor and a brother who was a veteran. And there was a strategic reason, I believe, why those stories were not encouraged, because there was a sense that those stories would not add value to passing the legislation. That's my understanding of things.
In the wake of the hearings, your work to make those hearings possible, to gather stories from the different communities that you went to help make the hearings a reality, what did you do in the wake of that?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I guess I'm thinking about my own experiences when you have that sort of mountaintop experience. Coming down from the mountaintop is often like, whoa, that was, where do we go from here? So
okay.
Where did you go from there?
Well, I mean, the movement, the hearings were going on in different cities around the country. I think where there were high population of Japanese Americans. So in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, LA, Seattle, San Francisco Bay Area. And that was just, in some sense, that was just the beginning part of the movement to get the testimonies. And then the testimonies had to be compiled by the commission, and then folks were then beginning to work on lobbying and going to Congress and lobby the effort to pass legislation on it. This first part was just the gathering of stories and hearing of the stories. For me, I didn't get involved in the lobbying because I ended up going to seminary, and so I kind of in that regard I put a pause on my proactive engagement with the redress, but I continued to receive email, not emails, but I think there were, I don't know if we had email then, but we had different announcements that were coming up because people were getting updated.
I want to ask about also this time, this next phase in your life. You mentioned seminary. It's also a time when you meet your wife, Suzanne.
Right.
Can you tell me a little about how you met and a little about Suzanne herself?
Yeah, we connected through this Japanese community center project, and we really connected. We were both in this kind of stage of our lives, I think, or me in particular, I think, kind of like getting back involved in life. And as I use the phrase spiritual resurrection, I think we had kind of long conversations about where we're in our lives. And she was from Japan, so she came here when she was in high school. And she was just 1 year younger than me. And we actually both were at UC Berkeley at the same time, but we never met during that period of time. And, but I think it was like our spiritual compatibility, because we were both kind of exploring sort of like spiritual mysticism, and that was a key part of our lives. And the Japanese American portion of it was different for her because she didn't have the same experience, but because she was from Japan, she had a different kind of personal history, which was very interesting to me. And her family, actually, her mom was in the bombing of Hiroshima as a child, and her auntie as well. So they had, they were hibakusha, they were survivors of that, and we were connecting on those stories and what that meant for her to be, a child of hibakusha. But long story short is that we really connected, and then she wanted to have family, and I was game. I was like, at that point in my life, I was open to new things and new opportunities to express life. And so we had a child in it was 1983. Sachi was our firstborn, and our second was in 1985. And Suzanne really also was one that sort of encouraged me to go to seminary and pushed me to go to seminary, because I think she could see, she called me a diamond in the rough, that I had a lot of refining to do, and school would help me, do that, and also save her from my kind of going all over the place with my wild ideas and things of that nature. So anyway, that was we kind of I applied to seminary in 1983. Was accepted in September of 1983, the same year our first daughter was born. Wow. It was kind of a crazy time, but I got a scholarship and was accepted to school. So kind of I went for it, and that kind of opened the door to a new chapter in life. So definitely, like, kind of the parallel experiences of experiencing being part of the redress movement and then getting in a new relationship and starting a family were all part of my spiritual resurrection for that period.
It's a great story of talking about the internal crisis that then you work your way through in a community-oriented way, and also find this personal spiritual connection with a partner.
Mm-hmm.
You were reborn in around the same time that you are, your children are born.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Very life.
Yeah.
Well, this might be a great place to pause. We'll pick up in our next session on your resurrected life.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael.
Sounds good. All right.